Our panel for this evening is to discuss the findings of the Institute's recent report entitled China's Espionage Dynasty, Economic Death by 1,000 Cuts. It was authored by our senior fellow and co-founder James Scott, as well as our researcher Drew Spaniel, with expert contributions from several of our fellows, including a few of our panelists. Now, China is often cited, as you know, in the media, not exclusively anymore in cyber technology forums, but really in national non-tech media as a major threat to the U.S. So it's important in our perspective that before you talk about how do you protect yourselves against this threat, understand what the threat looks like. How is the Chinese government shaping Chinese culture to view these efforts potentially as acceptable socially? What is China's spy structure, and what are the goals and objectives behind its espionage and digital theft efforts? So with that, we've just put together a really great panel to really dig into some of the findings of the report. To my immediate left here is Greg Cranley, an ICIT fellow and senior director of federal and U.S. public sector at Centrify. To his left is Todd Helfrich, an ICIT fellow and the VP of Federal for Anomaly. To Todd's left is Malcolm Harkins, an Institute fellow and Global Chief Information Security Officer at Cylance. Sorry, Global Chief Information Security and Trust Officer at Cylance. To the far left is Stan Wisseman, an ICIT fellow and security strategist at HPE. So, gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today. I want to start off by asking you to describe, for the folks who may not be very familiar with this, the objectives of China's 13th five-year plan and how these series of five-year plans are really driving China's led cyber attacks. You know, what sectors are being targeted, what type of information are they going after and successfully exfiltrating, and ultimately what is the economic impact of this theft to the United States? So anyone can start.
Todd Helfrich again, VP of Federal. From an anomaly perspective, we see China, impacting a number of industry segments. One is healthcare. We also see military and defense industrial base impacts. We have obviously, with the OPM breach, I'll talk a little bit later, probably in more detail. But China has a problem. The organization, the country is in poverty, right? There's a number of areas where they're trying to make advancement. And in doing so, they're trying to get there quicker than everybody else. So what we're seeing is impacts to loss of IP. U.S. entities are losing IP, also losing their information. So that's a...
Yeah, and kind of to add to that, I think, again, you see this 13th five-year plan, and it's a continuation, in many ways, an expansion of prior plans. That's a sustained growth in the scope and the scale of the activities to collect intellectual property, to grow local capabilities versus rely on the rest of the world, gain insights and intelligence. So it's far-reaching across almost every sector, from academics, healthcare, as was mentioned, tech, entertainment, minerals, materials. So it's really across the board.
And just to follow up on that, I think one of the other things that we have to look at is not just the closing of a gap, right, and trying to catch up as far as compared to the West, but also disrupting business, being able to get a leg up on potential mineral rights and other kind of business opportunities. I think, from that perspective, and that's part of the concern. It is not just a espionage play of trying to get information about other governments, and it's actually getting the IP and then leveraging the information they have to actually get advantage in different business opportunities. I think in 2012 we also saw a shift. We didn't really see them previously going after PII information. Well, they're attributed to going after a lot of the breaches recently, like Anthem, and so they aren't necessarily putting that information on the market. So if they are truly, like Deep Panda truly is responsible for some of these major breaches of PI, we aren't seeing that information being therefore sold like many other breaches. So they're collecting all this information for their own purposes.
Right, but I agree. It's definitely been up to the at the espionage level with government-to-government type things, industrial warfare, taking secrets and IP from that to copy and replicate and such. But I also think when the healthcare comes down, when you get to the healthcare area, they're looking to extract that information so they could actually see, like, okay, well, what's saleable? What do people have problems with, and what should we make? Do we need dialysis machines? Do we need, heart monitors? Do we need, defibrillators? Do we need all those things, and how we can put them on a black market and maybe sell them and get some greater goods?
Or they use that information to leverage against people, as
Sure,
far as,
there's probably an
they got the
opportunity.
information at OPM, and they have the medical records, and they can use that.
There is with the vastness of the collection of the information, it can be pivoted for multiple reasons.
Right.
And in some cases, many of the commercial enterprises that have been, had an attack, again, the business information that has been extracted might be because a company is thinking of expanding internationally. And one of the locations they're thinking of expanding in is China. And by understanding essentially the negotiation plan,
Right.
you can compete against other nation states for that foreign investment in your country. So there's, again, multiple purposes of this information. Or using that information in the case of some industries that have happened, where if they're trying to expand into our market, where we have a foothold, they can understand where to price to enter the market and essentially upend our local industries, and in some cases, essentially dump product on the market to create kind of market pressures and financial distress in certain aspects of our industries.
Yeah, putting companies out of business.
Exactly.
And I think one of the interesting things in the ICIT report was, as far as the impact, Parham, to your question on that, is as far as potential lost revenue of $300 to $500 billion and potentially 1.2 million jobs. Now, I'm not sure how you necessarily can measure that effectively worldwide, but the bottom line is that it has a direct impact to GDP growth and a direct impact potentially to jobs if you lose a market. If somebody else ends up being the producer of that product. So that's, again, as far as there's that gap to catch up, but now as they're catching up in different sectors, then they're, able to then compete effectively and then potentially just wipe out.
So we're seeing these cyber attacks. We're also seeing, having them take our IP. We're also seeing impacts where they're making acquisitions of U.S.-based companies.
Right.
I think it was Hillshire Farms that China actually acquired back in February timeframe. There's a significant impact there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as a reminder, I just realized if you could move the mics down and try to speak in them for the recordings, that'd be great. So thank you for that. The paper goes into a tremendous amount of detail describing the layers within China's covert spy structure. If you can talk a bit about what the structure looks like, and not just from a organizational kind of hierarchy perspective, but also what we can infer from how much they've put into this and the size and scope and scale and the resources that they've invested in this about Chinese strategy to compete on the global market.
Well, so, I just say that, it is advanced persistent threat, and they are persistent, and their organizational structures are always very much organized based on first steps, second steps, third steps. And like I said on so many good points, there's a lot of good things that we do for organizations to protect the perimeter. But it's got to get a little more sophisticated than that. They need to get a little more aggressive than that. And the other thing is as organizations in our country, and what we're trying to do and work faster and more fleet of foot and leverage technologies, not everybody works in the office. They're all over the world, just like Lana said earlier. So the idea of a perimeter anymore has kind of been destroyed. And the actual user now becomes a target. So to get to trick and have people make mistakes and be able to infiltrate that way is probably, based on what Verizon said and based on what Mandiant said, I think the number one reason why we have cyber attacks is because of compromised identities. So it's a user issue, but it's also the way we manage and we organize how users access the resources we provide to them. So I think the hierarchy that they have goes from one step to the other, to the other, to the other. And they just hand the information down as they go through it. And that's how people progress through it. And at the end of the day, because they have time, like the OPM, that was, what,
10
4
months.
years?
10 months and.
Right? I
They
mean,
have
they,
time and they have a lot of people.
right, and because it didn't look weird, because they had the guy's ID, and they just were doing what he would normally do, except they were taking the stuff.
Yeah, I think what you said is good, but again, getting, Parham, to your question, there's a lot of organizations, right? The paper covers a lot of structures in different parts of the Chinese government organizational structure. One way in which I tend to think of it is like a Venn diagram. They all have their independent areas, but there are overlapping areas.
Right.
And when you look at again, the scope and the scale of it, some groups have thousands, some have tens of thousands, some have hundreds of thousands. And when you put that collage together, you literally have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people doing this in small levels and big levels, and it's orchestrated. There's that kind of dance of that Venn diagram that's brought to bear for what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it. Now, to the point that was just raised about the identities, though that is true, the reality is those compromises occur because we've designed, developed, and implemented technology that is vulnerable. And we haven't prevented the issues at the stages that were necessary to make it harder to occur. And so we got to build it in. So in many ways, we're being victimized, but in many ways, we've created our own victimization because we focused too late in the cycle to prevent the issues, and we've defaulted as an industry towards detection and response, which means we're chasing it after the fact in a reactive mode, adding cost to ourselves, and then blaming others because they're victimizing us.
So, but, to Malcolm's point, the report does a great job. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I mean, if you want a great lesson in a variety of different threat actors, these advanced persistent threat kind of actors that's under the China umbrella, under the CCP, and in the third directorate, it's a great, list of actors with their tactics. Now, it's not necessarily complete. We don't necessarily know of all the different actors. But the numbers are just mind-boggling as far as the thousands of people that are actually performing these attacks. And then there's the next layer down, or two, that are more of a mercenary to hire. I mean, that aren't necessarily as controlled or governed.
Pure for profit.
Right. That are also leveraged in this ecosystem they've got. So you have all these different folks that are controlled in these different sectors and units of the third directorate. And then you have this more of a, perhaps less controlled, but I think that may have been one of the changes that's occurred in the last year, reining them in a little bit.
And to add to what Steve said, and Malcolm as well, that Venn diagram you spoke of, you can have multiple different Chinese organizations that are attacking you at the same time to obfuscate one or the other. It's a significant challenge, right? You found somebody inside your network, and you think you found it. You're pursuing to remediate that activity, and all of a sudden, the other organization's already in and already got what they wanted.
Hey,
Or somebody
look at this DDoS attack, and then they come over here.
Or somebody's physically in your environment because they're an employee, they're a contractor, they're a visitor, and coupling together the physical aspect of proximity or relationship or visits coupled with the cyber attack. So it's going beyond just the cyber. There are physical elements to this as well that thread their way through.
And that's a great segue to my next question. One of the parts of the paper I found the most fascinating was the detailed analysis on China's overt spy structure and how and I don't know if this is the word the paper used, but when I recall it back, it's almost the indoctrination of this culture that this is how you show loyalty. And so they're, in a way, raising future insider threats and sending them over here. That was a fascinating part. To your kind of Malcolm's, your point, talk a bit more about what they're doing and how they're making this happen, and really what organizations are able to do to maybe flag individuals before they can cause harm.
Yeah, so I think there's a number of things called out in the paper, both from students in academic institutions and students coming over, and the affiliations and the, again, scholarships that are offered to come here. The economic benefit U.S. universities get because they get to charge a higher level of tuition, right? The open access that's there. the affinity back with that and the plugging into certain research activities that is directed in many ways. So, so you have that level of thing occurring. You have, transitional folks coming over in many ways on visas, right? Because organizationally, we see the skills we want to have them, and we bring people over. But you also have visiting delegations that come over and spend time and visit and get to know people. And it's happening not only in the US, but in other countries as well. So you have kind of, a vast array of different people with different reach. Some of them perhaps more expendable, where if it's a student, if they can get plugged into a research thing that's maybe sponsored by a company to advance research for their industry, and they can plug somebody into that research effort, again, there's data that's flowing back there. And so again, it's a very well-rounded physical and logical orchestrated effort.
And I think it was interesting how the report called out how the United Front Workers Directorate and the Overseas Affairs is sort of like the long arm of, sort of looking for ways to influence and push. And I think one of the things that it points out in the title of the report is they use a mosaic approach as far as a way of, they can gather information from thousands of sources, and it doesn't necessarily need to have like 1,000 documents from one researcher. I mean, they can get one or two, and they pull all this stuff together, and they try to, like, form a mosaic. Well, what is the big picture? But as far as their sources, it can just be a single document from a researcher that has been willing to share with somebody else, and that information, that report on that research gets back to the mothership, as it were. Yeah. And again, they look for ways in which they can leverage foreign nationals, students, others, to be able to get this information back home.
Yeah. Sure, because they don't look like the enemy.
Yep, yeah.
Yes.
The face is always changing.
Yeah.
So in September of 2015, the U.S. and China entered into an agreement where they agreed to halt the theft of intellectual property that, for economic gain, I believe was how it was defined. So I'm curious from the panelists, A, do you think this had a positive effect in the real world, or did it really not change much? And actually, we'll start there, that question.
So I'll start. I think there's a few aspects to that. One, I think what the administration was doing is a good move. Having those public policy positions, being forward-leaning, having those dialogues are appropriate. Then you have to start looking and saying, okay, now, do we see a result of that agreement? And again, there's some data that suggests that we've seen less intrusions after that event, but then you have to beg the question is that data accurate? Did they get better at it? Did they use different tactics? Did they use different organizations, maybe the mercenaries, or pivoting off it of a different way to obfuscate who's behind it? So, on the one hand, the data would suggest it's diminished. On the other hand, you've got to wonder if the data quality and accuracy is truly there.
Yeah. Well, I would say that it's only been a year, right? So they got plenty of time. As Malcolm and the gentleman said, their organization is so large, and there's so many people. They're not doing anything today, and they could wait and settle down, and the reports could be right, and maybe it does quell down for now. But that doesn't mean you relax, because that's what you're hoping for, right?
If they're playing a 5, a 10, a 50, or 100-year plan, and we always play a short game.
Yeah, exactly.
You think, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You
lose. So I
it's
think,
a perception.
Yeah.
Getting back to the risk discussion, your perception of the risk looks like it's changed, but in reality, maybe it hasn't.
Yeah,
and I think, and the other thing was, I think, part of this was to get them to understand what is in bounds and what's not, right? We also do cyber attacks, and we do it for intelligence reasons, and we do espionage as well. And nation states are sort of expected to do that. But as far as the tactic of stealing IP for economic gain, we're trying to say, look, that's not a category that's okay. But at the same time, there were a lot of other categories that weren't included in that agreement. Kaspersky Labs claims that some of the attacks have pivoted toward Russia since the agreement was signed. That their attacks up hundreds of percent. Well, I don't know if that's true or not, honestly. But as you pointed out, it could come right back at us
Well, and
when it's in their best interest
well,
to
and
do
you
so.
get back to the economics of it. There's a lot of natural resources in Russia. There's competition for natural resources as they have a growing middle class. So they have to continue to, feed that economic engine.
Right.
And to some extent, when you get into core resources, yeah, maybe you don't go after intellectual property in the U.S. and Western Europe, but now you start focusing on, again, mineral rights, oil and gases, things that will be necessary for you to transition billions of people into an emerging middle class.
So from an Anomaly Push perspective, we believe that they've actually peeled back just a little bit, but at the same time retooled and changed their targets to Asia, et cetera. That's, what we've been seeing.
Interesting.
No, and they got plenty of time.
Yep. Stan had kind of hinted on this earlier by mentioning the different types of data that have been attributed to Chinese groups with regards to the theft of intellectual property. Several of our papers have talked about scenarios where the Chinese government could piece together different data sets and create really powerful tools with analytics and so forth. So I was wondering if we could talk about some scenarios that experts have been mentioning that are possible based on what we're seeing over the last several years.
OPM is a great example, if I can start things off.
Absolutely.
We saw from an anomaly perspective, there was actually an adversary after the OPM breach where the individual wanted to, they had data, they had a big repository they wanted to sell, and they purported that it was OPM. Well, China doesn't, if China attacked OPM and took that data, they're not going to make it available to the general public. They're going to keep it for their own purposes. So we found someone that, an adversary, they obviously had, it was part of actually a government breach, part of Department of Justice, but they had a big data set, an SAP data set that wasn't relatively, wasn't associated with OPM. But here's this adversary is saying, I've got the OPM data breach information, wanting to get revenue for data that, a breach that had occurred 2-3 years prior. So OPM, we were talking about data relative to healthcare, and OPM, you think about how somebody could be blackmailed, a government employee, data relative to OPM, their healthcare information, and maybe whether they were part of another breach. That data could be aggregated together, and all of a sudden I know Parham. And I know information relative to Parham that he doesn't want anybody else to know. So that data could be used against government employees, and it's important that we focus and get an understanding of that data that's been compromised and what China might be doing with it.
Yeah, and I think that's one angle of it. The other angle of it is if you are wanting to grow, let's say, a pharmaceutical industry to compete with our local pharmaceutical industry, if you understand the healthcare data across tens of millions of U.S. citizens, you understand, because you've collected information from our own pharmaceutical industry in terms of their research, you've been in universities, all that stuff, you could develop drugs, you could innovate and come to market faster, and potentially then bring that in at a cheaper price than what we're offering here. And again, because we all talk about and complain about the cost of healthcare in the U.S., as consumers, we'd all go, hey, that's great, you're lowering my prescription cost. But how did that occur? It was the aggregation of different data and then brought to bear to sell it back in that then harms the U.S. pharmaceutical industries. But as consumers, we might actually say, hey, well, that's good because you just brought the price down. So again, you have a confluence of independent things when you look at them, getting back to that Venn diagram, that get brought to bear that add to the economic growth in China. But again, it's that assimilation of all those things brought for a purpose.
Think about the stealth F-35
Yeah.
fighter that China actually grabbed and
Created their own. Yeah.
created their own replica. You take a look at pictures online, and it's public information now. But you look at the F-35 and you look at the J-20, and they're twins. Right?
Right.
So
Well,
That was supposed to be a stealth
Though
fighter.
at the
They
same
were-
time, we were taking pictures of them and shoving them on the internet too. So the
Right.
looks of it on the outside
Yeah.
might
Right.
not be the same on the internal.
Right,
Right.
if they don't have a disc. But they did that, not from pharmaceuticals, but they actually did that with medical devices.
Yep.
So they stole that.
So one of the things that was cited in the report, I thought was really cool, because I didn't know about it, but everybody familiar with George Orwell and Big Brother? And they cited this system, they speculate it's gonna be ready by 2020, it's called the social credit system. And imagine being able to, again, if you're worried about your population uprising against you and overthrowing you, you want to know what the heck they're doing and what they're watching on the internet and everything else. And so have a score at how well they're doing. And if they're outside that threshold on the bad side, then you clamp down on them further. If they're on the good side, they give them visas and give them some nice, attaboys, And so having a system like that that's looking at all their online browsing, all their actual activities is coming to bear potentially within China to be able to monitor their population and figure out whether or not there are some bad apples or ones that could threaten the power structure.
It sounds similar to many of the U.S. social networks, other than we're doing it for profiting on the people,
exactly.
and they're doing it to control
Making
them.
money, right? Yeah.
Giant knows exactly what you're buying.
I've been getting the 5-minute warning, so we are going to go a few minutes over. But I do want to close with a couple questions. There's a lot of conversation about the importance of profiling and attribution. There's obviously a place in that as part of an organization's response to threats. What do you think should be the balance, and how can an organization determine, with its limited resources, how much do you put towards products, technology, services, and how much do you put towards attribution, which could possibly help you prevent or at least anticipate who may be coming after you and what techniques they'll be using based on the profile of the group?
Well, I'll start there. I think the issue is, and I'll go back to what Linus said, it's less, you can always guarantee that the risk and the threat's always coming at you, no matter what's happening. The best thing you can do is educate, and get the user on board in what's going on, and do things so that the user can work and be productive and not make it difficult for them to do their job and have a protected user and a protected identity, as opposed to letting their identity be compromised, because then it doesn't really matter what's going on the outside, because they're going to be coming. And there's a ton of, there's some great perimeter technologies that block that and can do a lot of those anomaly things and do those things that look at like this kind of person, this. But from the regular guys in the Starbucks, walking down the street, sitting behind you in the theater, watching you log in, you don't know what he looks like, or her. You just don't know. So protecting and educating your people on the threats of cyber and how to use their devices, because the firewall is no longer the perimeter, this is the perimeter. And that's it.
Greg, I'm going to Black Hat next week, and I'm turning off all my Wi-Fi, my cellular.
I think they've turned it off. Well, those guys do that for
Right.
sport out there.
Follow Linus. I know a lot of folks have referenced Linus tonight, but the risk management framework, understanding what your risks are really important from an anomaly perspective, knowing those risks and also identifying what your adversaries might be and your adversary tactics. Knowing those TTPs, I think, are critical to fighting off the adversary. I think profiling, attribution is important. Know what you have, know the crown jewels, understand who might want to capture that information, and learn as much as you can about your adversary.
I don't think, honestly, that a lot of organizations have the resources to really follow that rat hole and figure out the attribution. If you can get the information, you can attribute it, understand the TTPs, that's great. But a lot of organizations just don't have the ability to associate certain attacks with an actual threat actor. They need to have awareness, and then to be able to take appropriate action to put the correct controls in place. But unless you are the federal government or a very large organization, I was a CISO at Fannie Mae, and I had a threat intel organization that we try to do some level of attribution, but there are limits as far as what we can do.
Yeah, so I'll take it where Stan was going, but I'll extend it further and going to what was said about risk frameworks. Again, we all kind of know risk is the equation of threat times vulnerability times consequence. The threat, as an organization, you can't control the threat. The government can do something about it. That is an uncontrollable variable. Consequence and impact, it is what it is. The only controllable variable you have is how vulnerable you are. And your strength of present controls against the vulnerabilities in your organization, the people, the process, and the technology. We've been victimized because we've allowed ourselves to be victimized because we haven't taken the steps to adequately prevent the vulnerabilities in the technology to begin with, and post-implementation focus on prevention. General George Marshall created the Marshall Plan, only U.S. general to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize. He had a quote, "The only way a human being can prevent a war, or win a war, is to prevent it." We haven't focused enough on prevention. And by focusing on the sexiness of the adversary and getting wrapped up around that, it distracts us from what we can control, which is how vulnerable we are.
And I agree 100% that we need to reduce that attack surface. And I've done, my whole career has been about building security into systems, applications, and programs. But going back to your point as well, Linus, is that we will be attacked and will be successful in some cases. The spear phishing attack will get through. The human firewall is a big aspect of that, but you also have to recognize that we have to also have the detective controls as well. So it is that balance of act of reduce that attack surface, build in the resiliency up and down your stack, and then.
And I think Linus was right, but I would rephrase his compromise as inevitable to attempt to compromise is inevitable. It doesn't mean you have to be compromised. And
Correct.
by a society accepting the fact that I'm going to be a victim, we're allowing it to continue.
Correct.
So the final question was going to be giving me your top 3 maybe action items that organizations should execute in terms of priority to prevent against some of these challenges we're facing. We're out of time, so in one word, if you could let me know what you think is the top priority for you. Greg, we'll start
Limit
with you.
access.
Okay, you can do 2 words.
Well, the way I speak is.
Yeah.
User education and information sharing.
Incentives and accountability.
Resiliency.
Fabulous. Please help me thank our panelists. That was fantastic.